All right. Well, let's just jump into it. Let's get started. And as people will continue to join, they'll hear our conversation regarding mental health. So thank you everyone for joining us here on Wednesday, May 26th, to talk about mental health, especially post-pandemic. I'm here with two amazing patient leaders from the Weagle Health Network. Before I introduce them, I figured I should also introduce myself. My name is Seth Rotberg. I am the patient leader recruitment manager at Weagle Health. I work on the patient leader network team, also personally impacted by a health condition. So this is always near and dear to my heart, mental health especially. Learned a lot about it throughout the years, and also the challenges I faced last year during COVID, which I'm sure many people can relate to when it comes to just access, affordability, and resources for those impacted by any mental health condition. So without further ado, I'm going to give a brief introduction of these two amazing advocates who have done a lot of amazing work in the space. I'll start with Natasha. She is an award-winning mental health writer, speaker, and thought leader. She's been involved in the space for quite some time, and I know that she has done some work in specifically bipolar disorder and related illnesses. She has written a lot of different blogs and articles for a variety of different resources, or yeah, I'd say resources, journals, and just has done a lot of great work in the mental health space. And then Cecilia is also a mental health activist, writer, media consultant, and radio astronomer. I can totally speak, I promise. She also has schizophrenia, and she believes that that doesn't define who she is as a person. She's the founder and executive director of the nonprofit, as she mentioned earlier, Students with Schizophrenia, and is also the content creator for the I Am Not a Monster Schizophrenia project. She has done also a lot of work as a speaker, as a writer, as just a content creator in a variety of different, you know, I guess, social media, articles, journals, speaking engagements, among other things. But I'm going to have both of them kind of share a little bit more about their story and their background. And we'll just start with Natasha. Perhaps just share a little bit more about why you decided to share your mental health story.
Sure. Well, thank you very much for that. So I guess that I wish that I had a story where I had a brilliant light bulb moment and I had to share my story, but it wasn't like that at all for me. What actually happened was I was in my early 20s, and having bipolar disorder was taking up a lot of my thought processes and a lot of my life. And so at that time, there was a cute guy. Okay, I'll just admit it. And I went to his work, and he's a writer. And so I read it, and it was amazing. And I thought to myself, I can totally do that. Now, obviously, that's just hubris on my part, thinking that I could just write. But that's what I did. I basically just started writing a blog at that moment, and it was anonymous at that time, because what I really wanted to do was express anything that came into my head without worrying about the repercussions of people knowing that it was me. And it turned out that I actually could write. I was really surprised, actually. And then I did that for about 7 years, actually, before becoming a professional advocate. So I actually spent a lot of time perfecting what I had to say and how I had to say it before I came out and actually started talking about bipolar disorder as a professional. And for me, that's been really great and really important, because it means that I've really solidified a lot of what I have to think on a lot of different topics. So it's really worked well for me.
Awesome. Well, thank you for sharing, a little bit about how you got involved, and, also, also, identifying this cute guy who actually ended up leading you to where you are today in some sense, right? Of just, hey, I want to share my story. I want to write about it.
It's really so sorry, but I just will say that I've always been tossed around by fate a bit.
Mhm.
So basically, I've taken what's been handed to me and I've run with it. That's how my career looks. I wish I could say I was a person who had a 10-year plan. I don't have a 10-year plan. I have a plan to take the experiences that I have and to take the opportunities that I'm given and run with them the best way that I can and try to reach as many people as I can with my own message. That's the goal. So that's how I approach this, which is maybe a bit different than some people, but that's how I approach it.
Awesome. Yeah, I mean, I love it. I love it. And we'll dive deeper into that shortly. But Cecilia, how about you? How did, I guess, share a little bit more about why you decided to share your mental health story?
Yeah, well, when I came to being open about having schizophrenia, I honestly didn't feel like I had much of a choice, basically because the police were involved. I'll set up the story a little bit. The night before, I was feeling pretty symptomatic and I admitted myself into the ER. I stayed there overnight and the doctor said that I was okay to go back to, at the time, my dorm room at Penn State. But when I went back to my dorm room, not only was I greeted by my three roommates and the RA, but also a can't help person. We all talked and we decided that I need another psych ward stay. And I was in no way refusing to go, and I have no past history of violence. Actually, someone with schizophrenia is more likely to be an abuse victim rather than abuser. I actually lived in a homeless abuse shelter for part of high school. So what happened next was really inexcusable. They brought in police officers in full uniform into my dorm room. They patted me down. I had to convince them not to put handcuffs on me. They then escorted me into a marked police car in front of the dining commons where friends were passing by, seeing me put into a police car. And by the time that I came back, well, the cat was out of the bag and I wanted to set the story straight. So then I opened up about my diagnosis. I don't regret being open about having schizophrenia, but I'm very frustrated and upset that I didn't get to choose how and when or if I wanted to be open.
Yeah, I could only imagine how challenging that is because you're right. Like, sometimes people have that option. In your case, it just kind of you were forced to share more and to be more open about that. And I can only imagine just what went through your head when it comes to just processing all that. And this is more of a, I guess, additional question, but do you feel like as much as that was the situation was challenging, do you feel like it has motivated you though to now bring more awareness and to help bring down the stigma?
It definitely does, was a catalyst for the advocacy and activism that I do. I'm very much wanting to make sure that students, particularly why I founded the nonprofit Students with Psychosis, wanting to make sure students don't experience the same things that I had to go through. And when we have extreme reactions, such as having the police brought into a dorm room, that gets in the way of someone wanting to reach out for help or opening up for help again. And I experienced that. And so I also advocate for when it comes to if someone's in a mental health crisis, so that it is treated in a less stigmatizing way.
Awesome. And I apologize. I realized earlier I said students with schizophrenia. It is students with psychosis.
Well,
Um,
we rebranded. We rebranded. So
okay, so it was
you're
a
not too far
rebrand.
off.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well,
We,
it's
re-
yeah, go on.
Yeah, we rebranded. We used to be students with schizophrenia, but many of our students come in without like an initial diagnosis. So they might not end up with having schizophrenia. They might have schizoaffective, bipolar, BPD, the list goes on. And we want to make sure we're more inclusive. I remember with our New York City club, we had a student come in, didn't yet have a diagnosis. They later got the diagnosis of bipolar. And they were like, can we still come to the meetings? And we were like, of course you can. You're still part of the family here. So yeah, so we rebranded.
Awesome. Awesome. Well, again, glad that you have that. I think that's an important resource for the community, especially I would say more the young people who might feel at times lost or trying to say, oh, where do I turn, or who else understands what I'm going through. Let's kind of dive into just this past year, COVID. It's definitely has changed a lot of our perceptions of just what it means to deal with our mental health. And we've seen it a lot, right? On the news and social media, everyone's saying, let's talk about mental health, let's talk about it, let's do something about it. And I think, it's definitely been eye-opening for, at least I would say, some of my friends who never really experienced mental health, people I've talked with about it, of just saying, what do I do? How do I get the support? And it's also, I think, been tough for those who are already struggling with it, right? Because even if you're, what I call an introvert, right? It's still good to get out and see people and connect. And so with all that being said, things are starting to open back up. And, I'm wondering what you both think, or what is your best advice for those finding it difficult to adjust back to this new normalcy of whatever normal means, right? But this kind of, how do we adjust back to it? So maybe, Natasha, you can touch on that first, of just what's some advice for those finding it difficult to adjust back to this quote unquote normalcy.
Sure. So the first thing I want to say is that there are two groups of people that we need to be talking about. And one group of people, in my opinion, have mental health concerns, and the other group of people actually have mental illnesses. Now, these are not the same two groups of people. I'm a person with a mental illness. I have a diagnosed serious mental illness of bipolar disorder. That's me. Now, someone who perhaps is experiencing anxiety that is not diagnosed, but they experience anxiety, maybe they have a low mood because of what's been going on with COVID. Those are people with mental health concerns. Now, both of these groups of people matter, but I want to make sure that we're inclusive of both. So when you take a look at mental health as a whole, I think it's important to remember, as we go back to life, back to normal, that we don't have to do it at the same speed as everyone else. So if you're experiencing anxiety, if you're experiencing depression, if you have a mental illness, that's, maybe that's affecting the speed at which you can go. Maybe that's affecting you wanting to take off your mask. Maybe that's affecting many of your decisions right now, as everyone else is maybe racing to a restaurant. Maybe you don't feel comfortable with that. And that's really okay, because I've often said that when something really impacts your life like this, we often can get to the same destination, but we often do it with a different path. So what we talk about here, when getting back to normal, we do it, we're going to do it, right? People with mental illness are going to do it. People with mental health concerns are going to do it. But maybe the path is just a bit different. So it's about finding what works for you and doing that. So slowing down, changing your actions. And then I think it's also really important, whether you actually have that illness or whether you have just a concern, is to reach out, because other people are experiencing what you're experiencing right now. Other people are finding it difficult to get back to the normal that we once took for granted. And so don't think that you're alone in that difficult spot, and reach out to others who are experiencing that, and reach out for professional help if you need it. Because certainly making a plan that's going to get you from today back to a normal may require some professional help, and that's okay too.
I love how you distinguish these two different groups, and also understanding, the idea of one being inclusive of both, but also kind of going at your own speed, right? I think, personally, this is my personal thoughts, is sometimes, we compare ourselves to others, right? As a society, as individuals. And I think it's taking a step back and saying, okay, what's best for me, and what's going to be best for, whether it's my, if I'm dealing with mental health illness, or I'm one of those people who have those mental health concerns. So I love that you mentioned kind of reach out to that support, but also that distinguish between the two, because that's something I didn't even think of until now. So I appreciate you sharing that. What about you, Cecilia?
Absolutely echoing when it comes to going at your own speeds. I know for me, I'm someone who struggles with a lot of social anxiety. And in a way, I kind of like where everything has been virtual through all of this, because I'm a very I struggle in like large crowds even before COVID. And I live in New York, so that's fun. But I know for me on a personal level, I have struggled with trying to adapt on things, trying to going back to normal here in New York City. A lot of things are opening up again. In the beginning of the pandemic, funny story, I was actually traveling and I got stuck in St. Louis for a while. And I stayed there for 3 months because I live in Brooklyn. I didn't feel quite comfortable at the beginning of COVID in March to come back. And when I came back to New York, I realized that staying inside the house and then suddenly going onto a subway and just the overstimuli there. I'm also someone who lives with autism. I'm autistic. So it was quite an adjustment coming back. And I found myself relearning coping skills that I thought that I had learned years ago. And I thought like I never had to relearn them and go through all that steps again. But sometimes you have to relearn your coping skills. And I just want to echo the message of taking it at your own speed, be patient with yourself, and do what makes you feel comfortable.
Absolutely. And yeah, I mean, I think you both definitely addressed, just this new normalcy. And I also hope, Cecilia, I think it's important also to keep kind of these virtual options open, right? Because I don't think it's by all means any negative thing, nor did anyone say that, but it's more of like, where was this perhaps before COVID, right? And can we keep this afterwards? Because it might also help with accessibility for those that prefer, hey, I want to be in the comfort of my home and I want to, speak to someone professionally or, personally. So thank you both. And kind of going off of that, in your opinion, has the pandemic shifted the way we think about mental health? And maybe Cecilia, you can start us off with this one.
I think it definitely shined a light when it came to like different accessibility needs, like Seth, what you were addressing before. I think that individuals that maybe never experienced isolation before, that became an issue that got some light. I know with the psychosis community, isolation, even before COVID, is a very prevalent issue for us. So I think that during the pandemic, it did sort of help everyone sort of at least experience some of our needs. And I'm hoping that it helps with creating some global empathy when it comes with someone who maybe struggles with isolation or struggles with mental health needs, because maybe we've all gone through it at maybe different levels. Again, making that distinguish that Natasha made with those who have a mental illness, maybe mental health concerns, but hopefully we are maybe a little bit more globally aware of mental health needs after this.
Yes, I agree 100%. And I think it's so important to make sure people get access to it. I know we'll discuss that shortly, but it's so crucial just to be aware of it and also just kind of shift our perceptions. I know I mentioned it before, but it's been eye-opening for some people. I mean, even for myself, of struggling with my own kind of anxiety and trying to deal with it and thinking, is this me overthinking it? And then, my cousin, other family, friends saying, no, I'm dealing with it too, right? Like knowing, I guess, also that I wasn't alone and it wasn't just me dealing with it, but that other people were also, struggling, also made me feel a little less isolated. Natasha, what about you? What's your opinion when it comes to, do you think the pandemic has shifted the way we think about mental health?
So I think, as many people have said, and as I say in presentations all the time, we all have mental health, right? So every single person alive on this planet has mental health. And just like we have all other kinds of health as well. And so most of us take our mental health for granted. We go about life, we do what we need to do. And much like our heart beats every single day and we take it for granted, we've also taken our mental health for granted because it's just there. So when, however, we've struggled because of the pandemic, suddenly mental health becomes more of an issue because suddenly it's not there. And I think that is one, it's the very first tiny little step forward that people need to make in order to understand what not having your mental health is like, right? So I'm mentally ill. That's the thing. So I don't take my mental health for granted for a second, right? When I'm having a good day, when I'm having a good hour, I am not taking that for granted because I know how hard I work to actually get there. And so someone who had a mental health challenge during the pandemic now has the tiniest sip of what that's like. But I think it's really important to realize that it is really tiny. You know, what a person experiences on a temporary basis during a pandemic is not what a person with a mental illness experiences. And so it's really important to remember that they're not the same, that you can't equate the two. And the other thing I think that matters is that we continue to take the little bit that people have learned and move the conversation forward. So, you know, in a year from now, we're going to forget about this, right? Everyone who had a mental health concern is going to forget about it. They're going to say the pandemic's over, it passed, that was a transient thing, no big deal. That's what's going to happen. And so it's our job as advocates to actually take the conversation, continue it, move it forward, and make not just talk about what happened during the pandemic, because that's one thing, but how it relates to everything else and how it relates to everyone else, because that's how we're going to use that pandemic and make it actually something that's a little tiny bit positive for the mental health sphere.
Great points by both of you regarding just, how we, I guess, how do we, continue to just kind of shift the way we think about it, and not just, again, like, okay, COVID's done and we're back to normal, and like, no, it's something we need to continue to discuss, and also make sure people are aware of the resources and support. I just think it's so important, and kind of goes to our next question, which is one that I'm also very passionate about, is kind of like just mental health support and how expensive and difficult it can be to obtain. And, I'll give a quick example of just my own personal experience last year trying to find a therapist. And I had like a whole spreadsheet of 40 different therapists. And I remember my 25th therapist or something like that was just like, and these were emails calling them. She was like, you got to have a list of about 20 to 25. And if a therapist is telling me that's how long it's going to take me to find a therapist, and I feel like, okay, how do we do this better? How do we improve it so that it's easier to obtain and access? And I know that now there's all these different apps out there. Personally, for me, I like to talk with someone versus I know some you can text back and forth, but for me, I'm like, well, I can just text my friend or my dad and just say, hey, what's going on? So that all being said, where do you think the biggest opportunity lies when it comes to improving this access to mental health resources? And Natasha, maybe you can start us with this one.
Access to mental health resources is a huge challenge, as you just illustrated with your own story, with your own experience. Now, on my website, I have a number of resource locators for mental health resources. So those are done through SAMHSA, those are done through the NIH, that kind of thing. So those resource locators are available. But as you said, they can be very expensive and they can have long waiting lists. Both of those things absolutely can be true. So while I encourage everyone to use a mental health resource locator, it won't necessarily solve the problem for you because of all the access challenges that we have. So I think that we also need to think about, well, who knows better about mental illness and mental health resources? And the answer to that question are people who work in the field. So for example, a doctor or a psychiatrist, even your GP, right? The person that you see as a family doctor, that person may be able to give you more insight than you can find online. Also, think about mental health charities like the National Alliance on Mental Illness, for example, NAMI, or other mental health charities that are more local to your area. I'm sure that Cecilia has some great ideas for what would work there. And those are also going to have maybe more insight than you're going to see online. And the thing that I want to say really carefully as well is, while there's a lot of information available online regarding mental illness and mental health, a lot of it should not be read. It's not worth your time. You need to be concerned about the quality of information that you get. And, by getting information in person by someone who's actually licensed, yeah, that's great. You're going to get some decent information there, hopefully. But if you are going online and searching for information, that would make you very much like everyone else. You want to make sure and search, reputable sites that have been medically reviewed, and sites that are not fringe sites. So sites that actually are medically based. Those are the kind of things that you actually want to go to for information. So I work for a site called Healthy Place, but there are many sites. Of course, Healthline is great, and the Mayo Clinic is great. And there are many great sites with lots of great information, but make sure, like I said, it's medically reviewed and it's not fringe stuff, because those two things are going to get you into big trouble. I want to just mention one little thing that, it can be very appealing when someone tells us what we want to hear about mental health, which is something like, if you just don't eat gluten, everything's going to be great. Or if you just drink more water, mental health's going to be fine. Whatever it is, right? These are the fringe people. And I'm not suggesting there aren't people for whom gluten works, because there are celiacs in the world, but I'm talking about everyone else in the world. You need to be concerned about that medical advice that you're getting. Is it actually medical, or is it just someone spouting something off? Because what you need is actual help. Mental health is a serious thing. It's just like heart health. It's just like lung health. You don't go and get help for your heart from some random guy down the block. You don't do that. And you don't do it with your mental health either. So wherever you choose to go, make sure the quality is there. And the thing you can do is take that information that you've learned online and take it to a doctor and say, does this make sense to you? Because the last thing you want to do is go down some winding road that is, some snake oil person, and find yourself 6 months from now worse than you've ever been, because you listened to the wrong person. That's the worst case scenario. I've seen it over and over again. So please don't do that.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Especially that last point where, I deal with general anxiety and been dealing with it for, I don't know, too long now at this point. But like, for me, I've always been on medication, and, I was living in DC, was seeing a neurologist, but she also worked as a psychiatrist. So she understood medication. When I switched to Boston, I was like, oh, I know the neurologist, but he's not a psychiatrist. And when I was switching to a different medication, it actually impacted me. It wasn't his fault. It was more of like, that's just what he knew. And I think what's important, Natasha, is like you said, is going to the right people, right? Who have that background or that knowledge based off of what your needs are, right? I'm not going to go to a foot doctor if I have, dealing with heart stuff or mental health, right? I'm going to go to, in my case, I'm going to see a psychiatrist, or also maybe see a therapist, right? People who specialize in what I'm looking for. So I think it's very important. What about you, Cecilia? Access, affordability, the whole 9 yards. What are your thoughts?
I definitely think that having access to the proper medical treatment is definitely not only the choice of the individual, but also their right. When it comes to having accessibility options, it breaks my heart whenever I hear a fellow person with psychosis can't afford their medication, or they're worried about going to the hospital because they might be involuntarily inpatient and then end up with a humongous bill that then they would have to be paying off. That gets in the way of people reaching out for help. I know for me, I've been in the psych ward 6 different times, and I'm not close with my parents, so I was off of their insurance. And as a college student, one of my psych ward stays wasn't covered by insurance, and here I am with a huge bill, and that made me scared for reaching out. We need to make sure that mental health care is not intimidating and not financially burdening the individual. We have to make sure that our mental health care is there designed to really protect and help the vulnerable. That's what it's supposed to be helping, and it's not currently set up in that way. Also, tagging on to some of the things that Natasha made some really good points of making sure that when you are seeking medical treatment, that you are getting the medical help from a trained mental health professional. With that said, there are other things when it comes to like filling the gaps in needs of care. For example, peer support is still very important. The lived experience perspective, very important. Doesn't take the place of seeing your mental health professional, but it does help with finding community, finding fellow people, making sure that you don't feel alone, maybe learning different coping skills that helps for one person, maybe it might help for you. But again, doesn't take the place of a mental health professional, but at least in my experience, it definitely helps when it comes to that quality of life and again, finding that community and not feeling alone.
Certainly agree. You know, you want to find that community of people who understand you, who can kind of be there for you. Again, it's not a replacement, but it does help with quality of life of knowing you're not isolated and you're not the only one dealing with it. And you know, I can agree with what you mentioned regarding like that fear of like being open or finding that support because of maybe the cost of it, right? I remember when I finally found a therapist, I was like, I went through 40 different people. I was like, this has to work. Like, I'm going to make it work. Like, they can see me, so I'm going to make it work. And luckily, it has worked. But my mindset should be like that in the first place, where I have to be like, okay, this has to work because I don't want to go back to that list and try to find someone. And I know, at least, you know, in the US, you know, there are a lot of a good amount of therapists, and I've talked with some, you know, our private practice, which can cost quite a lot of money, right? It can cost $100 to $200 per session. And as whether you're a young person or you're, you know, under resourced, that can be a lot per week if you need weekly support. And so, you know, my big thing is how do we improve that, right? How do we make it so that also therapists, you know, from their perspective is also getting paid by the insurance companies for their work so that they don't have to go into private practice and say, hey, I need to make ends meet because I'm not doing it right now. So I think there's a lot of like challenges on that end of things too, of just making it more just accessible and affordable so people aren't fearing, hey, I'm afraid to reach out, or hey, I'm afraid to switch my therapist because I want to make sure, you know, I find someone again in an adequate time. Um, so that's just, you know, it's something that I truly passionate about. I appreciate both of you for sharing your viewpoints on how we can improve that. Speaking of that, I guess, do you have any recommendations for affordable mental health resources or tools? You know, maybe also including that peer-to-peer aspect of it as well. Either of you can jump in at this point. I'll let you pick this time.
Well, I guess I would do a shameless plug for students with
There
psychosis.
you go.
For students with psychosis, we offer over 28 hours of facilitated programming every week for our students. And we make sure that our programming is accessible with live captioning. Some of the meetings are just text only as well. So when it comes to that, I love going into those meetings with the students. I learn a lot from the students, to be quite honest. They share their experiences, and it's really finding that community. It's a space where also students can be students, where they don't necessarily have to feel like a patient there as well. It's finding fellow peers and relating to individuals. So I'll recommend, of course, students with psychosis. Other great resources out there is checking out NAMI, also Mental Health America. Another really great resource for someone who is struggling with psychosis or living with psychosis would be checking out Strong 365. They have a great resource page there that helps finding early intervention treatments and access there. So I would very much recommend Strong 365 as well.
All right, Natasha.
So I'm a little bit weak in this area because I actually live in Canada. But one of the resources that I know that you might not be aware of because most of these people are American, is something called the BC Schizophrenia Society. And it's just bcss.org. And they have what I consider to be one of the great collections of information about psychosis specifically. So if that's something you're struggling with, that information is I have found it to be very useful. I don't personally suffer from psychosis, but I found it very useful when it comes to writing about psychosis and understanding psychosis and understanding people who are experiencing that particular symptom. So that's one that I would definitely say. I agree with all of Cecilia's picks, basically. And that's about it. I'm sorry.
Totally fine. But Natasha, maybe share some small tips and tricks that helped you on your own kind of journey that might help others.
Yeah, so people ask me all the time what my coping skills are. And it's funny because I've been doing this so long. I've had bipolar disorder and I've been working with it, and I've been working with coping skills for so long. I sort of don't even recognize them as coping skills anymore because they're just my life now. But the big one for me, and the one that I feel, well, there's two actually that helps people. The first one is a sleep schedule. If every person with bipolar disorder or depression, and I can't speak to other illnesses, but those two illnesses I can speak to specifically, if every single person got on a sleep schedule where they woke up at the same time every morning and went to bed at the same time every night, I swear to you, symptomology would go down 50%. I can't say that on an individual level, but collectively, I think that's probably true, because particularly for bipolar disorder, it's actually a circadian rhythm disorder. So our rhythms, our body rhythms are actually out of sync. And what we need to do is to put routines in place in order to resync them. We have to force that synchronization to happen because it does not naturally happen for us. So that's the number one thing. Get yourself on a schedule. If you can add things into that sleep schedule during the day, so add things like exactly taking the medication at exactly the same time every day, that really matters. Making sure that you eat in regular intervals, that really matters. Making sure that you exercise, that really matters. Though, I realize that some people say, well, that's really obvious. It's actually not. We expect to do these things without thinking about them. But the fact of the matter is, if you're not well, you have to think about them and you have to put effort in them to actually make them happen. And then the second thing that I think is really important, and again, I realize this sounds simple to some people, but it's actually using logic to check your thoughts. Because what I feel is that my bipolar brain is one thing, but I, Natasha, am a different thing. We are not the same things, because I can actually separate myself from my bipolar disorder, and I can watch my bipolar brain work. I can watch it think thoughts that make no sense. I can watch it be illogical. I can watch it be irrational. I can watch it be overly emotional. All of those things I can actually see my bipolar brain do and know that it actually isn't me. It's the illness. So I take a look at those thoughts and then I apply logic to them. So if something happens, maybe I'm supposed to get together with someone this afternoon, let's say, but the person doesn't show up. Who knows why? Maybe, something came up for them and they couldn't reach me, and who knows. But my bipolar brain maybe would be very upset about that, and ridiculously so, right? To an extreme that would not be reasonable at all. So while I watch my brain get upset and get emotional and maybe start to think, well, maybe that person hates me now, maybe that person's mad at me, et cetera, I use logic to look at that and say, okay, what are the chances that this person has suddenly started hating me? Probably not very good. Same thing with them being angry. Did anything happen? No? Okay. And same thing with emotionality, right? If I'm feeling depressed and I'm looking at my emotion, I'm looking at it and going, that's out of step with the situation. My emotion is at a 10 when realistically it should be at a 2. Okay, I can see that that's my illness. I realize that glosses over a lot, but the idea is to separate yourself from the illness, because you are not your illness. You will never be your illness, and your illness will never be you. To separate yourself from your illness and then try to apply logic and reason to an illness that doesn't. You need to do it because your illness isn't going to.
I feel like I should drop the mic on that last. Boom, that's it. We're done. Well, thank you. No, it was all very helpful. And it's important just, just I guess going out and doing it, right? Knowing that your illness is not going to do it for you. You're not defined by your condition, and also just find what works for you when it comes to coping, right? Everyone copes differently, but figure out what you enjoy. And then I love the part about staying on schedule. I think it's so important, and I noticed the difference as well when I stayed consistent with like even my morning routine. I'm like, wow, I feel so much better. Cecilia, what about you when it comes to any kind of small tips or tricks that have helped you along your own journey?
Well, I cannot agree more when it comes with getting a good sleep schedule. I know for me, if I'm also someone who struggles with my sleep, and if my sleep is struggling, hand in hand, my mental health is struggling. If I haven't slept for a few days, particularly I struggle with word salad. I would struggle with scattered thoughts. I would struggle with my paranoia. I would think the world hates me if I'm not getting my sleep in. Also, something that I find beneficial is music. Music really helps me when I'm someone who hallucinates. I see, hear, and feel things that aren't there. And listening to music helps not only drown out the hallucinations, the auditory hallucinations, but also helps replace it with something positive. Also helps me getting into like a better mood and such. So music is a huge part of my day-to-day life. Probably my roommates would not like that throughout the years. I have had roommates who are like, "Are we listening to that song again?" Because I'm one of those people that listen to songs over and over and over again. But if it's working for my mental health, I need it. But anyway, music is a huge thing for me. Also, getting outside, which was a challenge, of course, throughout the pandemic, especially living in the city. I'm here in New York. But for me, I need to get outside. And if I can't get outside, then at least like opening a window and sitting next to the window, I found very beneficial. That's some tips and tricks that I have up my sleeve.
Awesome. Yeah, it was very tough even to get outside during the pandemic, especially in the winter time when it was also cold out, and you're like, all right, now I gotta deal with something else on additional layer. You got COVID, and it's like it's cold out. But you're right. I think those are definitely some good tips and tricks. I'm a big music person. I'm like, hey, I'm gonna throw on the headphones. Let's do it, right? For some reason, headphones for me, like just it's like a mental thing. I'm like, all right, I'm like in the zone now. But yeah, let's kind of go. We're gonna hop actually into some questions we got from some of our attendees. So, one of the first ones was that someone asked was, I'm gonna kind of skip around a little bit, but this one. So, how do you balance supporting others as an advocate and taking care of your own mental health?
That's a really good question. I think it's important to have mental health boundaries in any type of relationship, whether it's a romantic relationship, family, friends, a coworker. So having a conversation with yourself first, learning your mental health boundaries, knowing that they can change at times. It took me a while to learn my mental health boundaries. So be patient with yourself there. And then communicating those boundaries with the individual and enforcing them, not being afraid to enforce them as well in a kind way. It's important to have that conversation. Also knowing when to take care of yourself. I think of often like when we're on a plane and we're told about like the oxygen mask. Sometimes you need to put on your oxygen mask before helping it. And not sometimes, you always put on your oxygen mask before others. I'm not a flight attendant, but so that's my advice there.
Natasha, is there anything you want to add?
So I think that the name of the game is exactly what Cecilia said, which is boundaries. And for me, there are many times that I'm talking iron boundaries. I'm not talking movable boundaries. I'm not talking wavy boundaries. I'm talking iron boundaries. And that's what keeps me safe. That's what keeps me okay, so that I can help other people. And quite frankly, I think the thing that you have to realize is that not everyone is going to get it. People often think that they own you because you're online, because you post, because you write, because you do this, because you do that. They feel like you should help them. You should help everyone. And I would love to. I would love to be able to do that, help everyone who came to me for help, but I can't. I need boundaries. They're really critical for my own wellness. And even if someone hates me because of them, it's really important that I do it anyway.
Boundaries, so important. Couldn't agree more. This is a good question that we got next is, how would you suggest coping with a family member or friend who doesn't understand or believe per se your mental illness?
So I'm going to just jump in here. This is a big problem that so many people have. If you're feeling like someone that you're dealing with doesn't believe in mental illness, yeah, you're not alone in that. For me, it actually took a very long time for me to get to a relationship place with my mother where she would understand what a serious mental illness was. She didn't get it. She, what she did in reaction to my bipolar disorder actually harmed me because of how she reacted. It was very, very difficult. And I would say it took almost a decade to come to a place where now she does understand what bipolar disorder is, and she does understand what's appropriate in terms of dealing with it with me. So that's the first thing I want to say is it can take a long time. But the second thing I want to say is what happened, the whole reason that a person doesn't believe in mental illness is a lack of education. It's ignorance on their part. And I'm not saying this is an insult. I'm ignorant about a lot of things. So the person just doesn't know the facts. And the facts of the matter are an illness like bipolar disorder has been around for centuries. This is not a new thing. Mental illness is not new at all. Society has been dealing with it since there have been written records. So what you need to do with a family member, let's say, who doesn't believe you, is to do some research and then do some educating about that topic and say, look, I know maybe mental health is something that you're not very familiar with. So let's together work to research this topic in some trusted sources and learn together, right? So how can you do that? How can you both read a book together, for example? There are great books out there for people with family members with mental illness. So how can you both read that book, or can you both go to a website, or can you both go to a therapy appointment if that's an option for you? Those are things that you can do to try to help that other person, to educate that other person. And yeah, like I said, you have to give them time, because if you think about back to when you were diagnosed with whatever illness you have, it probably took you some time to digest that. It certainly took me a long time to digest that. And it's going to take the other person a long time to digest it as well, because they don't want you to be sick. There's none of us want the people that we love to be sick. And so denying it is a reflex that's almost understandable. What do you mean you have bipolar disorder? No, you don't. That reaction is extremely common. And it's because the person cares about you. I know it's hard. I know it, excuse me, produces blockages in your relationship, but it's actually because they love you. So education is key, and time. Cecilia, anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, definitely echoing the need for education. And if it is something that you feel like will help benefit your relationship, with like going through the materials with the individual, that's something you can do. But I do also want to add that it isn't the responsibility of the person living with the diagnosis to educate the other person. So if you are someone that has a loved one with a diagnosis, we live in the age of Google, right? We have so much information. So it's really should not be placed on the burden of the individual to educate you. Also, I just wanted to add, like, if it is a loved one, you can also love someone from a distance. If they are struggling, having you struggle with your mental health, you need to, again, like, put on your oxygen mask first. That's something you might need to do. Also want to echo that family doesn't have to be biological. For me, I'm not very close with my family, and part of it is because they initially weren't accepting of my diagnosis. There's a lot more there. Like I mentioned before, I lived in a homeless abuse shelter for a while, so it's not just because of not accepting my diagnosis, but a lot of it, a lot of the friction was, at least initially. I remember being on the phone with my mom, telling her that I was sick, I needed help. And she would tell me not to tell anyone about it, that people are going to think that I'm crazy, people are going to think that I'm dangerous, I won't be able to get a job. And it took me 8 months after a suicide attempt to finally reach out because I was listening to my parents. So again, echoing that it's okay to love people from a distance. It's a family doesn't have to be biological. And when it comes to education, it's so important that people learn more about mental health, mental illnesses, but it's not the responsibility of the individual living with a diagnosis to educate you.
Yeah, I'm like speechless. Both of you are just right on point with each of these questions. And so it's just so important to just overall get that support, but knowing that again, like you just mentioned, Cecilia, like family may not always be biological, right? Like it could also be some very close friends or just other people in your life that you've come across that are there for you. Any kind of tips for handling mental illness in the workplace that either of you have? Cecilia, I saw you nod your head.
Yeah, we get this question a lot with our students when it comes to opening about their diagnosis, either in the classroom or in a workplace environment. And first I want to say is that you don't owe anyone your diagnosis. You don't have to share or anything that you don't feel comfortable with sharing. With that said, you are, it is important when it comes to like if you want to ask for accommodations that your employer respects those. So I do recommend asking your employer if you feel comfortable about different accommodations. And then also when it comes to accommodations, I want to really implore both in classrooms and workplaces to help create spaces that an individual doesn't have to ask for accommodations. Of course, there's no one size fits all, so accommodations are always going to be needed, but creating a space that is more mental health friendly, more neurodiverse friendly for individuals who maybe don't want to out themselves about their diagnosis or come forward asking for accommodations are already in an environment that is more accommodating, because we all win when we're in a more mental health, neurodiverse friendly environment. So I really implore workplace environments and classrooms to work on their environments.
Anything, Natasha, you want to add?
So I think everything Cecilia said was great. The one thing that I want to add is just my personal experience. So I worked in a very big fancy company, and I worked with someone who had bipolar disorder, who had a 15-year career with that company. And one day he decided he had to divulge his bipolar disorder to his manager in order to get an accommodation that he needed. And of course, as people know, there are protections under the law. You cannot be fired for having a mental illness. However, what ended up happening was this man's career at that company was over. He said to me, "You never, ever tell. You never tell." What happened was he got passed over for promotions. He wouldn't get projects that he wanted. There was nothing, he had done nothing wrong, but his 15 years meant nothing compared to the fear that people had around his bipolar diagnosis. Now, I'm not saying that happens in every company. Of course it doesn't. People are different, companies are different, culture is different. And so, but my point here is protect yourself and think of yourself first. So as Cecilia said, you don't owe anyone your diagnosis. You're not your manager, not your coworkers, no one. It is your personal, private health information. If you choose to disclose it, then that's fine, but you absolutely do not have to. And I think that sometimes people feel like, number one, they're being dishonest by not disclosing. And number two, they're adding to the stigma if they don't disclose. But my opinion is you need to protect yourself first, because no one's going to put food on your table but you. And if you don't have a job, then that's not going to be possible. So while I am all for workplaces doing better, and I'm all for classrooms doing better, I think that as the individual with the illness, I'm a little self-centered, and I say to myself, look, if it's going to harm my career, I'm not going to do it. Like I said, that's not a universal experience, but it's one that I want to share.
Yeah, thanks for sharing. And it's always a tough one, right? Of how to share it. Does it make sense to share? Will the company, how will they perceive it, right? I mean, my own personal experience is like, hopefully you're at a place where they understand, accommodate, and the culture is the right fit, but that's not always the case. And you gotta just be aware of that as, I guess once you say you can't go back and it's like, oh, I'm gonna reverse time and stop and pretend like I didn't say any of that. So it's you brought up a lot of great points on just like being mindful of who you share it with, how you share it, and just kind of being prepared for what the reaction might be. I know we only have a minute left, so any last kind of thoughts, pieces of advice that either of you want to share before we close out this great panel discussing mental health?
I just want to say thank you for everyone that came to and listened to this panel and all the wonderful questions. Thank you for continuing the conversation about mental health, my challenges too. Thank you for being here listening, but also after this panel to continue the conversation, talk to one of your friends about maybe something that you learned about in this panel.
That's a great final thought. I love it. My final thought was actually going to be, I really hope that everyone who watches this takes a minute to take a deep breath. One of the things that I find extremely beneficial during the day, and this is every day of my life, is taking a second and taking a really deep breath to calm down, to calm my anxiety, to calm my brain, to calm everything down, slow everything down so that I can react just a little bit better to what's going on in my life. And I think that just that, learning how to breathe, is a huge thing that can help whatever mental health concern you may have.
Couldn't agree more with both of you. I think we got to continue to have this conversation, right? I mean, as we're closing out Mental Health Awareness Month, the conversation doesn't just stop because the month's over. We have to continue to advocate for ourselves and for our loved ones, and really just help, figure out more opportunities and resources for those either, living with a mental health condition or experiencing any aspects of it. And so let's continue to have these conversations. Thank you both again so much for taking the time out of your day to just be here to share your personal experiences, sharing some pieces of advice and wisdom. So let's keep up the good fight, and I hope everyone has a good rest of their day.
Thank you, Seth. Thanks for inviting me.
All right, take care, everyone.